Number 8. The McBarge. While we associate McDonald's with buildings on the land, there have been attempts to take the brand out on the water. One such version of the fast food giant on the seas is the Friendship 500, a vessel also nicknamed McBarge. Not that customers took a voyage out onto the ocean or anything, no. This 187-foot-long barge was kitted out as part of Vancouver's Expo World Fair back in 1986. Visitors would step aboard the floating restaurant, which was designed by the architecture company Allan Ltd, to get a glimpse of what the future of society might look like. Oh, and eat a few burgers along the way. There was a great potential in the McBarge, but for one reason or another, it just didn't work out. McDonald's may have lost interest because several years later, the barge was still at the False Creek location. The creek's owner reportedly had to order the company to do something about it. From the expo site, it went to a fjord called Burrard Inlet in British Columbia. There it sat gathering dust for nearly a quarter of a century. Today, it's moored on the Fraser River at Maple Ridge, also in British Columbia. McDonald's doesn't own it anymore. So what are they going to do with this oddity of the fast food industry? There have been a few potential uses talked about over the years. It would have probably made a pretty decent homeless shelter if the owner hadn't turned the idea down. The McBarge was also earmarked for a museum at one point. Sadly, public interest in preserving the McBarge doesn't seem to be in evidence. Some reports state that the barge is now going to be turned into a, wait for it, restaurant. What are the chances, right? Though this time it looks like the menu will feature seafood rather than patties and fries. Number 7. Aircraft graveyards. These varying locations across states such as Arizona, California, and New Mexico have an awesome and cinematic feel. Just look at all these planes gathering dust. And because they're out in desert conditions, gathering dust is an understatement. The Davis-Monthan Air Base in Arizona, home to the Aerospace Maintenance and Regenerations Group, or AMARG, is part of a network of so-called graveyards that house thousands of planes. These vehicles are from both commercial and military sectors. Here you'll see Boeing airliners, as well as Lockheed T-33 Shooting Stars and other pieces of aviation history. More often than not, the planes are used for their parts, but many are actually parked here in anticipation of being flown again in the future. Why park a plane out in the middle of the desert? The answer lies in the super dry conditions. The possibility of rust is kept to a minimum, so the word graveyard, or in some cases boneyard, is a little inaccurate. That said, these places are regarded as somewhere that aircraft go to die. They certainly look abandoned and somewhat lonely out there, huh? The good thing is that they play a role in recycling much needed parts and keeping the industry going that way. They may never take to the skies again, but they provide an interesting talking point for aviation fans. No wonder they've been used as locations for movies, including Waterworld. Yes, at the Mojave Air and Spaceport in California, areas can be filled with water and splashed around in by film crews. Bet you never thought the movie where Kevin Costner is surrounded by water was actually shot out in the desert, right? Number 6. The Knight Rider truck. Speaking of on-screen action, we thought we'd mention the old series Knight Rider, and specifically an abandoned vehicle that was featured alongside David Hasselhoff and his famous talking Trans Am car KITT. The Trans Am is well looked after to our knowledge. However, that can't be said about the Flag Mobile Unit. This GMC General Articulated Lorry was the rolling headquarters for the Foundation for Law and Government. Many was the time when KITT would drive into the trailer round back for a pep talk with the show's crime-fighting team. Unfortunately, the lorry was left in Idaho for 15 years, where it may well have rusted into oblivion. There's a happy ending though, with some dedicated Knight Rider fans riding to the rescue. In 2021, it was reported that they traced the flag unit to its remote location using modern technology. These guys, who are called Knight Rider historians, really went the extra mile to trace the vehicle through its computerized data, though apparently this took some doing. Remember, the show was made back in the 1980s after all, before the modern technology we enjoy today existed. All in all, it took years to get to the lorry, and that's without the trailer. The next phase of the operation is to find that, so the pair can be reunited. For more information about the Knight Rider historians and what they get up to, check out their website. Number 5. Salton Sea Trailer Dump Site. The iconic Knight Rider trailer may be missing, but there's one place you can definitely find a bunch of old trailers if you're interested, and that's the Salton Sea area of the Colorado Desert in Southern California. Back in the first half of the 20th century, it was considered quite the place to be. What you'll find now, however, if you head to this once sparkling desert oasis, is a vast number of abandoned trailers. 1905 saw the Colorado River meet the Salton Sink, creating a wet environment there where none had existed before. It wasn't intentional. This happened due to the introduction of man-made irrigation canals combined with rain that ultimately altered the landscape. Soon, a parched part of the state was a go-to location. Who'd have thought the arid, dusty place would go on to play host for businesses such as marinas and trailer parks? Of course, things didn't last, and when people left to find better prospects elsewhere, they left their trailers behind. These range from the completely dilapidated to the artistically decorated, and if you're brave enough to venture inside, you can discover a fascinating, if somewhat icky look at how people used to enjoy themselves back then. Would you venture into the desert to explore these abandoned motorhomes? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more abandoned places content. Number 4. Ferrari find and more. It's really surprising how some incredible vehicles are abandoned, not to mention the eye-opening reasons why this happens. Take this case, which was reported back in 2018. A house in North Carolina was going to be reduced to rubble, but underneath was a hidden treasure and every car collector's dream. An underground storage unit was accessed by Tom Cotter of Barn Find Hunter. This wasn't a barn, but who cares when he managed to track down not just one, but 4 classic vehicles that haven't been driven for almost 3 decades. Inside the unit were a 1966 Ferrari 275 GTB, a Shelby Cobra, a Morgan, and a Triumph. What's the story here? Well, it sounds like this quartet of gas guzzlers was a proper labor of love for the owner. He liked to take good care of his vehicles, so how come they wound up abandoned down there? Turns out his mechanic sadly passed away. In what's arguably the best tribute ever paid to a mechanic, the owner then decided that no one else should touch the cars. The tragic event happened in 1991, and they were in limbo ever since. The brakes had seized on the Ferrari, Morgan, and Triumph, but the Shelby was still drivable. Amazingly, the cars were in great condition, though they hadn't been entirely left alone over the years. A bit more than exhaust flames were released when those engines got fired up. What are we talking about? Mouse droppings. Oh yeah, it wasn't only the chassis that was squeaking that day. It's also reported that crickets were hopping about the place. So this find was a treat for fans of abandoned automobiles, but not so much for those who hate creepy crawlies. Number 3. Ekranoplan. This impressive piece of Russian military history had a sad end when it was abandoned on the coast in the Caspian Sea. The Ekranoplan looked like a formidable conflict vehicle back in the days of the Cold War. Today, it's an unfulfilled project that is reportedly sinking below the surface. So what does Ekranoplan mean? It translates as wings in ground effect. Sounds like a weird name for a plane, but it actually sums up what the vehicle does. You see, it looks like a plane, and it does fly, but very close to water. In that sense, it's a sort of boat, only instead of floating on water, it floats on a powerful air cushion. The vehicle had a top speed of 373 miles per hour. Why do this? For starters, the Ekranoplan has a very low profile, making it a nightmare to detect for enemy radar, and not being able to see this thing coming is fatal. The craft was capable of deploying Sunbird missiles, which have a 64-mile range. The Ekranoplan was also capable of packing nukes, so we're thinking it's probably for the best that ultimately the Soviets didn't get it off the ground, or rather the water. How did it end up stranded in the Caspian Sea? It's actually quite a sad story. Apparently, the Ekranoplan was being towed to a museum when it came loose and got stuck in shallow waters. The abandoned plane, or boat, or whatever you want to call it, is reportedly being visited and photographed, but it's not what people had in mind when they wanted to put it on display. Number 2. Abandoned supercars in Dubai. Picture the scene. Dubai Airport. A top-class sports car pulls up on the tarmac, let's say a Ferrari. The owner gets out and heads for a private jet. They get aboard, the plane takes off, and just like that, they're gone. But wait a minute. What are they going to do about their car? They're coming back for it, right? Hello? In actuality, there's a good chance they won't. Did you know that there are lots of abandoned cool cars all over in Dubai? As well as Ferraris, there are BMWs, not to mention a Bugatti Veyron, worth an eye-popping $1.6 million, according to reports. Is this just a rich person's game? Ditching perfectly good, not to mention obscenely expensive vehicles and skipping town? Well, yes and no. The people believed to be doing this kind of thing are rich, or rather, they were wealthy enough when they landed in Dubai. Times change, of course, and as any good accountant will tell you, the economy can go down as well as up. The thinking is that visitors from outside the Middle East fell foul of an economic dip and figured it was best to not spare the horses. Sorry, luxury sports cars. Couldn't they simply tell authorities that they're in financial trouble and work out a payment plan or declare themselves bankrupt? Never an easy decision, but certainly not an easy one here, it seems. You don't just get in hot water for not paying your debts in Dubai. You are branded a criminal and face jail time. Not that everyone is doing it for those reasons, apparently. Some reports note that people may just be getting bored of their rides and leaving them for someone else to take care of. We can handle that for sure. If you're willing to make a trip out to Dubai, perhaps a trip to the airport for salvage is in order. Number 1. Icecraft Carrier. Our last story is in many ways the most extraordinary. When you think of something that floats on the water, what construction material comes to mind? Wood? Fiberglass? Concrete? Concrete may sound like a crazy thing to make something that floats out of, but you'd be surprised. And there's an even more incredible substance that you can build, say an aircraft carrier out of. Water itself. Come again? Well, not water when it's in its liquid form exactly. We're talking about ice. Who came up with this eye-popping idea? Russia? The US? Nope. Canada. Makes sense, we guess. It's cold enough over there. This happened back during World War II. Nothing was off limits when it came to defeating the forces of Hitler, it seems. Even something like this. Based in the land of bacon and maple syrup, the idea was actually pushed by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Dubbed Project Habakkuk, the basic concept was to create an aircraft landing strip from ice. Well, not quite ice. Pykrete was the stuff used for the purpose, made up of ice but also sawdust. Invented by Geoffrey Pyke, this stuff apparently wouldn't sink, or more crucially, melt. 1943 saw the idea take shape in the form of a 1,000-ton prototype realized in 1:50 scale. The carrier was made on Patricia Lake in Alberta. How would it move? Via a giant rudder and no less than 26 motors. Sadly for Churchill and company, the result proved too expensive to create. And you know what they did next? You guessed it, abandonment. What's left is apparently still at the bottom of the lake in 2021.
Number 10. Great Train Graveyard. There's a collection of dozens of rusting locomotives and train cars near the mesmerizing salt flats of Uyuni in Bolivia. Known as the Great Train Graveyard or Cementerio de Trenes, it is located on the outskirts of an abandoned former transportation hub. During the 19th century, there were plans to expand the Uyuni region's train network, but the project was never finished. As the local mining industry began to dry up, developers ran into problem after problem with other countries along the planned route. In the meantime, they encountered increasingly complicated technical issues. The project eventually ground to a halt, leaving over 100 trains parked in the middle of the desert. Most of the vehicles were imported from Britain during the early 20th century. They've been vandalized and are heavily rusted from the region's salty winds. The eerie train graveyard is open to visitors, most of whom stop by during a trip to the Salt Flats. It's situated among a vast landscape completely devoid of houses, cars, and people for as far as the eye can see, serving as a constant reminder of how far from civilization it is. Number 9. St. George's Church. In the tiny Czech town of Lukova, roughly 2.5 hours outside Prague, there's an abandoned 14th century church filled with eerie white figurines. Nicknamed the Ghosts of St. George's Church, these ghastly sculptures are positioned on the building's pews, in the doorways, and at the altar. Built around 1352, St. George's Church sits atop a hill overlooking the small town. After the roof caved in during a funeral in 1968, the church was abandoned and the congregation began holding mass outdoors. People thought that the building was cursed or haunted, so they simply avoided going inside and left it to decay. The community eventually became interested in restoring the church, but couldn't afford to do so. In 2012, local artist Jakub Hadrava created the 32 life-size sculptures that currently occupy the building in hopes that they would attract visitors. He sculpted the spooky figurines by making plaster casts of models draped in sheets. The statues are said to resemble the German Bohemians who once lived in the area and were expelled from the Czech Republic after World War II. Thanks to Hadrava's creation, St. George's Church has become a popular tourist destination. Proceeds from the visits go toward maintaining and repairing the building. And while most visitors are excited to see the inside, some have refused to enter, according to caretaker Petr Kokol, who said that the spooked individuals couldn't get past peeking through the doorway. Number 8. Scary Dairy. The Camarillo State Mental Hospital was established in Ventura County, California in 1932. At the time, it was a state-of-the-art facility at the forefront of mental health treatment. The experts there made groundbreaking progress with treating conditions that were previously considered untreatable, helping more patients than ever become functional members of society. As part of their therapy, patients grew fruits and vegetables, raised animals, and ran a dairy farm on site. The farming program was canceled during the 1960s, and its buildings, including a big barn, were abandoned. In 1997, the hospital itself closed its doors for good. California State University took over the property in 2002. 7 years later, it bought the land that the decrepit dairy farm sits on. Nicknamed this scary dairy, the spooky graffiti-covered barn is reduced mostly to its framework. It's fenced off to prevent visitors from inflicting further damage and for their safety. Some people still dare to trespass over the fence, but the area is rumored to be heavily patrolled by police for this exact reason. For those who just want to get a good look at the scary dairy without actually going inside, the property is open to the public daily. Number 7. Varosha. During the 1970s, the rich and famous flocked to Varosha, a resort town on the island nation of Cyprus. Located in the city of Famagusta, it was once one of the world's most popular tourist destinations, attracting famous stars like Elizabeth Taylor and Brigitte Bardot. That all changed in 1974 when Turkish forces invaded Cyprus and took control of Famagusta. Varosha's 39,000 inhabitants fled with plans to eventually return, but that never happened and it was no longer a luxury travel hotspot. The site has remained abandoned and fenced off ever since. Nature has reclaimed much of Varosha, which is off limits to the public. Only the Turkish military and United Nations personnel are allowed there. Photos snapped by urban explorers feature crumbling buildings and rusting cars. Clothing still hangs on the racks inside stores, and tables remain set for the next meal, serving as a chilling reminder of when people rushed out of there on practically a moment's notice. Turkish authorities reopened Varosha to residents last year, but it remains closed to tourists for now. The controversial decision to tear down the fences surrounding the resort town fueled the ongoing tensions between Greek and Turkish Cypriots who have been at odds since Turkey invaded the island almost 50 years ago. Because of this, whether or not to rebuild Varosha is a complicated matter that will require a delicate diplomatic approach. Would you like to check this place out? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. Clausland Mountain Tunnels. Just north of New York City, in the village of Nyack, a series of graffiti-covered cement tunnels run through a mountain. Known as the Clausland Mountain Tunnels, they were built in 1910 as part of the Bluefields Rifle Range, a planned training ground for the New York National Guard. The tunnels enabled soldiers to safely pass under and around the open firing range. But the Bluefields Rifle Range was a controversial project from day one, with National Guard officers calling it one of the costliest blunders in state history. Soldiers were tired of having to climb through the mountains to get to it, and local residents complained that stray bullets were putting holes in their barns. The site closed after operating for just 3 years. Naturally, the tunnels became a haven for underage drinking and the inspiration for paranormal and urban legends. Various tales revolve around suicide, satanic rituals, murder, and the mafia dumping bodies in the tunnels. But these stories seem to be rooted in the imagination because there's little to no evidence to suggest that any of these things actually happened. In 1984, a group of panicked college kids showed up at the local police station. They claimed that they drove up the mountain around midnight and were met by several robed figures who blocked their path and came at their vehicle with weapons. When the police went to the scene, nobody was there. On top of possibly being haunted, the tunnels are filled with large bugs, including wolf spiders and cave crickets. For those who dare, they're open to the public, although one entrance has caved in, so it's uncertain how safe they are. Number 5. Chicken Church. Sometime during the 1990s, a man named Daniel Alancia dreamed about building a prayer house and took it as a sign that God wanted him to build a church. Although he was a devout Christian, Alancia envisioned a site that welcomed people of all religions. More specifically, he wanted the building to be in the shape of a dove and to sit atop a hillside near his home in central Java, Indonesia. The ambitious dreamer bought an acre of land and got permission to build and got to work. Alancia's creation ended up looking more like a hen than a dove, but he went ahead and opened it to the public anyway. It had soon earned the nickname Gereja Ayam, or the Chicken Church. Various religions held services on the upper floors, while the lower levels housed a drug rehabilitation center and a care facility for disabled children. At one point, the site also functioned as a mental asylum. But the bills weren't getting paid, and Alancia eventually went broke. To make matters worse, not everyone shared his humanitarian vision, and they didn't hesitate to let him know. Feeling he had no other choice, Alancia left the bizarre building behind in 2000. Since then, time and the elements have taken their toll on the Chicken Church, immersing it into a state of decay. Ironically, the site has become more popular since it was deserted. Photos and stories of the church have circulated widely across the internet, drawing curious visitors from near and far. People have even gotten married and had their wedding photos taken there. Visitors have helped make the Chicken Church look a little less decrepit by covering the walls with vibrant murals and opening a cafe inside. Only Mr. Alancia himself knows exactly what was going on in his mind when he decided to build this strange structure, but its late blooming popularity means that at least one of his desires was fulfilled: to see people enjoying the Chicken Church. Number 4. Alianello Ghost Town. An earthquake in 1980 left the Italian hamlet of Alianello unfit to live in, with unstable buildings that would only become shakier with time. The municipality of Aliano issued an eviction order, but only about half of Alianello's residents cooperated at first. The rest held out for as long as they could, with most finally leaving when the municipal government cut them off from basic services. It wasn't until 2000 that the last resident finally left Alianello. Many people left behind personal belongings, which still sit inside the village's deteriorating buildings. Visitors will notice cradles, strollers, bottles of liqueurs and preserves, telephone directories dating back to the 80s, furniture, and more. The hamlet's first telephone line was installed in 1978, just a few years before everyone was ordered to leave, and some homes didn't have running water, according to former resident Domenica Rinaldi, who spoke with Atlas Obscura. A man named Vincenzo, who used to live in the village, described it as an extended family of sorts. Everyone knew each other, and there was a strong sense of community. But while former residents remember Alianello with a certain fondness, the eerily silent, crumbling ghost town might seem spooky to an outsider. Nature is reclaiming the site, with trees and other plants growing inside the deserted homes that are falling apart and covered in mold. Number 3. Spree Park. The East German government built Spree Park outside of Berlin in 1969. During the communist era, the thriving amusement park saw around 1.7 million visitors every year. After the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunified, it changed owners but remained in operation. The park's new owner, Norbert Witte, smuggled cocaine into the country by having it stashed inside imported ride parts. His crimes eventually caught up to him, leading to Spree Park's closure in 2004. In addition to Witte's illegal activity, declining visitor numbers were also factored into the decision to close. Over the following years, the property fell into disrepair and was swallowed by the surrounding landscape. An arsonist set fire to the park in 2014, destroying some of the remaining rides and other structures. 2 years later, a Berlin-based company bought what's left of the park. There are reportedly plans in place to reopen the park next year. Many of Spree Park's attractions have been removed, but a Ferris wheel, roller coaster, and teacup ride still stand, along with the crumbling remains of a restaurant, zoo, and cinema. For only €5, curious urban explorers can safely and legally tour the property during certain times of the year. Number 2. The Pyramid of North Dakota. In a remote corner of North Dakota, near the tiny city of Nakoma, there is a reinforced concrete pyramid standing tall against the open sky, with several smaller buildings surrounding it. Known as the Stanley R. Michelson Safeguard Complex, it was developed in the 1960s at the height of the Cold War. Its purpose was to shoot down incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles from the Soviet Union should tensions reach that boiling point that everyone feared. The $6 billion project came with dozens of missile silos and launching silos, a cache of nuclear missiles, and the giant pyramid, with a circular shape near the top on each side. The complex was only operational for a short time before it was shut down due to the enormous costs of running it, as well as concerns about potentially firing missiles over friendly territory. It was decommissioned during the 1970s, and only a few people have been allowed into the complex ever since. The closest anyone can get to the complex is the road that runs along it. Visitors are allowed to take photos, but don't think about trying to go any further. The Cavalier County Job Development Authority purchased part of the facility in 2017, hoping to turn it into a data processing and security center with the help of Google or another big-name company. Other parts of the property have been sold and auctioned, but some private owners have failed to sell their parcels for what they consider to be a fair price, suggesting that the site isn't very desirable, and it makes sense. After all, the aging pyramid is a bizarre eyesore reminiscent of Cold War fears of impending nuclear disaster. Number 1. The Green Line. The Mediterranean island nation of Cyprus is divided by a UN-controlled buffer zone that keeps ethnic Greeks in the south and the ethnic Turks in the north. This demilitarized zone, sometimes called the Green Line, was implemented in 1974 after Turkey invaded Cyprus. It stretches 112 miles across the island, measuring 11 feet wide at its narrowest point and 4.6 miles at its widest. Most of the buffer zone is heavily restricted, allowing only military and UN personnel to enter. For nearly 50 years, it sat mostly untouched by humans and frozen in time. In the capital of Nicosia, a rusting passenger jet sits outside the abandoned airport. Vintage cars remain parked in lots as if they're still waiting to be sold. Old stores and cafes line the empty streets, and the once bustling commercial buildings are quietly falling apart. The environment is dominated by a seemingly post-apocalyptic feel that's impossible to ignore. There are areas along the buffer zone that are inhabited, as well as several crossing points between the north and south, which were opened in recent years as tensions cooled somewhat. But there are still many complicated issues to sort out, and for now, the divided country's future remains uncertain. Number 9. Soviet submarine disaster. Russia is notorious for its secrecy and for withholding information from the public. This is no different than during the Cold War, when the Soviets covered up as many of their military disasters as possible. Back in 1960, the Project 613 submarine sank 900 feet to the bottom of the Barents Sea during a training exercise. As the 14-man crew began some torpedo-firing exercises, their first missile failed to launch. They placed it back into its compartment and ran a check on the operating system. Shortly thereafter, there was a massive explosion and the submarine began to sink rapidly toward the seafloor. 15 minutes later, it hit the bottom. Chaos ensued, and it was only when one crew member threatened the others with his pistol that everyone began to cooperate with each other. Everyone put on protective suits and escaped through a narrow torpedo shaft at the back of the submarine. The water was pitch black and they had to take their time rising to the surface to avoid getting sick from the pressure change. It took about 3 hours, and the crew encountered harsh seas once they got to the top. One survivor named Chaim Shainin spent 3 months in a compression chamber, where gradually decreasing amounts of pressure were applied to his lungs. After that, he spent another 7 months in the hospital. In 2006, he shared his story with the entire world on ABC. Shainin recalled that his superiors had told him not to breathe a word of the disaster to anyone. More than 55 years later, he was finally breaking orders. Number 8. Trapped in an air bubble. 3 days after a tugboat sank off the Nigerian coast in 2003, a survivor was the last thing recovery divers expected to encounter. After all, the whole purpose of a recovery effort is to find bodies, not living humans. Much to their surprise, they found a man alive and peddling water in a small pocket of air inside the wreck, which sat 100 feet below the water's surface. The survivor, 29-year-old Harrison Ojegba Okene, had spent 72 terrifying hours trapped in the air bubble that had saved his life. But Okene knew that the air supply would run out. Can you imagine? In a desperate race against the clock, and after noticing a diver's light in the water, he tried to swim to the rescuer but failed to catch their attention. Lacking other options, Okene returned to the air pocket where the carbon dioxide he exhaled and the frigid waters increasingly threatened his life. He eventually saw another chance to catch up with a diver and was successful on his second try. Okene tapped the man's shoulder, and at first the rescuer thought that he had bumped into a corpse, but he realized Okene was alive and started working to get him to safety. The survivor had to spend 60 hours in a decompression chamber to avoid the ill effects of coming up from deep water too quickly. Sadly, the rest of the crew didn't make it, and as if he wasn't already going through enough, superstitious locals accused Okene of using black magic to stay alive. He was so traumatized from the ordeal, he vowed never to return to sea and found work as a chef on dry land. In a later interview with the Associated Press, he explained that he was still haunted by the ordeal and that he was plagued by nightmares and painful memories. Number 7. Self-amputation for survival. During a solo descent down Utah's remote Bluejohn Canyon in 2003, 27-year-old Aron Ralston's arm got pinned against the canyon wall by a dislodged 800-pound boulder. He had no way of calling for help and hadn't told anyone in his life about his hiking plans. For 5 days, Ralston tried desperately to free his arm while rationing what little food and water he had, but he remained stuck. Convinced he was going to die, he videotaped his final goodbyes to his family and carved his name, date of birth, and the date he thought he was going to die into the canyon wall. But Ralston made it through the night, motivated by visions of himself playing with his future child. In the fantasy, he had a partially severed arm. By the next day, his trapped arm had started decomposing. Ralston knew he had to act quickly if he was going to survive. Using the force of the boulder, he broke his ulna and radius. Then, he cut off his forearm using a cheap multi-tool with a dull blade. He stemmed the bleeding as best as he could with a makeshift tourniquet, then rappelled down a 65-foot cliff and began the 8-mile walk to his vehicle. Along the way, he encountered a family who summoned help. 4 hours after hacking his own arm off, and after losing 40 pounds and 25% of his blood volume, Ralston was rescued. He wrote about the harrowing experience in his appropriately titled New York Times bestseller, Between a Rock and a Hard Place. Do you think you'd be brave enough to cut off your own arm if it meant saving your life? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. Rescued from the Himalayas. In early 2017, a young Taiwanese couple named Liang Shengye and Liu Chenchun traveled to Nepal to hike in the Himalayan mountains. They were last seen leaving for a hike in northern Dading despite heavy snow. The couple failed to call their families in Taiwan the next day as promised. A few days later, relatives contacted Nepalese authorities and asked for help finding Liang and Liu. Police launched a search, which was disrupted by snowfall and avalanches. Finally, 47 days after the couple disappeared, rescuers found them on a ledge. Sadly, Liu had passed away 3 days earlier, leaving Liang on his own to fight for survival as he slept near her corpse. The 21-year-old had lost 66 pounds. He was riddled with lice and one of his feet was covered in maggots, but he was otherwise, for the most part, okay. Liang told rescuers that he and Liu were trying to find a village during a snowstorm when they slipped and fell over the waterfall, landing on the ledge. Unable to climb up or down from it, they were stuck on the platform at an altitude of 8,530 feet. For the first 2 weeks, they survived on what little food they had in their bag. After that, they subsisted on just water and salt. While Liu's death was certainly tragic, finding Liang alive after so long was nothing short of a miracle. Number 5. The Lykov family. When Russia became communist, the Bolshevik government started persecuting people for their religion. In 1936, a Russian Orthodox couple named Karp and Akulina Lykov fled their hometown in southern Siberia with their 2 children, Savin and Natalia, in tow. They built a ramshackle hut several thousand feet up a mountainside in the remote Siberian forest 150 miles from the nearest town. While living in isolation and entirely off the land, Karp and Akulina had 2 more children named Dmitry and Agafia. Living in the wilderness brought its fair share of tragedy to the family. In 1961, their crops were killed in a frost, forcing them to eat shoes and bark to stay alive. Akulina died from starvation. It was a sacrifice she made so that her kids might survive. While flying over the area in a helicopter in 1978, a group of geologists spotted the Lykovs' home. They were shocked since they were far from the nearest town. The family insisted on staying at their makeshift home of nearly 50 years, which was described by its discoverers as cramped, cold, filthy, and musty. It wasn't until then that the Lykovs learned that Stalin was dead and that the Soviet Union had become a world power. In 1981, 2 of the children died from kidney failure and another perished from pneumonia. Karp died in 1988, leaving Agafia to fend for herself. As of 2019, she was still living at the site despite being of old age and suffering from cartilage deterioration in her lower extremities. By then, she had built a decent shack and had goats and chickens. Number 4. Lost and found at sea. Stephen Callahan is an experienced sailor, naval architect, and inventor who designed and built his own boat, the Napoleon Solo. Acting on a childhood dream, he sailed the vessel alone across the Atlantic in 1982. During the return voyage, a whale or an equally large and powerful object slammed into the boat, tearing a hole in the hull and causing water to flood in. Knowing that the Napoleon Solo was going to sink, Callahan gathered what supplies he could and boarded his inflatable life raft. He only had a few days worth of food and water and was alone in the middle of the ocean, 800 miles west of the Canary Islands, but was drifting eastward. Callahan caught fish with a spear gun and used a solar still to produce a pint of fresh drinking water every day. In the coming weeks, he passed by numerous ships, but none of them saw him. As he drifted into tropical waters, he suffered from dehydration, saltwater sores, and constant hunger and thirst. At one point, Callahan's raft ripped, and he struggled to keep the raft afloat. He was about to give up and let things take their natural course, but his will to live kicked in, and he managed to fix the raft. Finally, after 76 days lost at sea and drifting some 1,800 miles, some fishermen spotted Callahan in the waters of the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. He had lost a third of his weight and was too weak to walk properly, and was covered in sores but was mostly okay and left the hospital that day. In the years following his rescue, he designed an inflatable life raft that's better equipped for long-term survival than the one he was stuck with. Number 3. Real-life castaway. One day in November 2012, a fisherman named Salvador Alvarenga set out to go fishing in a 25-foot boat with a 23-year-old co-worker named Ezequiel Cordoba. They departed from Mexico's west coast with plans to spend 30 hours out in the Pacific. A 5-day-long storm blew the small boat off course, damaging its motor with electronics. With no anchor, sails, or oars, the boat drifted aimlessly. The men were forced to dump the 1,100 pounds of fish they had caught, and a lot of their equipment had been damaged in the storm, leaving them with minimal food and supplies. A search party gave up on finding them after 2 days. Meanwhile, Alvarenga caught and ate fish, turtles, birds, and jellyfish with their bare hands. They caught rainwater when they could, but mostly drank turtle blood and their own urine. Cordoba reportedly died 4 months into the journey. He had given up hope of rescue and was too grossed out to eat the raw sea creatures that Alvarenga caught. For 6 days, Alvarenga sat and had conversations with Cordoba's decomposing corpse. He eventually snapped out of his insanity and, making good on his promise not to eat his friend's body, threw Cordoba's remains overboard. In early 2014, After 438 days lost at sea, Alvarenga spotted land. He swam ashore and encountered a couple outside their home. Unbeknownst to him, he was in the Marshall Islands. Aside from being dehydrated and malnourished and needing help walking, his health, surprisingly, hadn't suffered too much, considering the circumstances. Number 2. A soldier finally surrenders. If you ask most people, World War II ended in 1945 when Japan surrendered to the Allies. But one Japanese intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda, he simply refused to believe that the war was over. He spent the next 3 decades in the jungle in the Philippine island of Lubang, relying on his guerrilla warfare skills to remain hidden and avoid capture. Onoda was initially joined by 3 comrades, one of whom left the jungle and returned to Japan in 1950. That same year, another comrade was killed. The remaining man survived until 1972. In 1974, Onoda's brother and former commanding officer traveled to Lubang and finally convinced him that the war had ended. Onoda later explained that he believed Tokyo's pro-US government was scheming against him in their previous attempts to persuade him off the island. He formally surrendered to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos in his Imperial Army uniform, cap, and sword, which were all still in good condition. Marcos pardoned Onoda for killing as many as 30 people he mistakenly took for enemy soldiers throughout the years. Onoda moved to Brazil and became a farmer in 1975 and returned to Japan a decade later, where he created nature camps for children. He passed away in 2014 at the age of 91. Number 1. Real-life Tarzan. In 1972, during the Vietnam War, a man named Ho Van Tan packed up his 2 sons and fled civilization. He had already lost his wife and 2 other children to a bomb dropped by US forces, and he wanted to protect his surviving family members. For the next 40 years, the family lived in complete isolation, relying entirely on nature to fulfill their needs. They built wooden shacks, drank water from a nearby river, and ate fruit and meat sourced from their surroundings. The group went undetected until 2013 when locals discovered them living off the grid and alerted the authorities. Having long believed the family was dead, residents were shocked. The authorities forced them to return to civilization. Refusing to believe that the Vietnam War ended decades ago, Tan spent every day holed up in the corner of his room and obsessing over his desire to return to the wilderness. He died in 2017. One of Tan's children, Ho Van Lang, had lived in the jungle since he was 2 years old. It was all he knew. He had never seen a car, struggled to understand the concept of electricity, and didn't know what women are, according to filmmaker Alvaro Cerezo, who made a documentary showcasing Lang's life. Lang became known for his gentle, childlike demeanor and his superb survival skills. He now leads a productive life and is integrated into society on some level, but he struggles to adjust well enough to completely abandon jungle life and eventually return to living in a hut. Thankfully, he is no longer isolated from the world and maintains regular contact with his older brother and other community members with more mainstream lifestyles. Thanks for watching. Do you have any incredible survival stories of your own? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!